Rain fell hard over the city that night, and in a room on the third floor of a mansion that appeared on no map, Lucian Cross stood looking at the woman who had been by his side for nearly 2 years, then said exactly 5 words. "Get out of my house, Nora." Not one of the 20 men standing around the room dared to breathe too loudly. Nora Bennett sank to her knees on the cold stone floor, unable to understand why the man she had loved for 2 years was suddenly looking at her as though she were a stranger. She begged him to listen to her explanation. He didn't look at her even once. She asked him what she had done wrong. He simply ordered his men to take everything from her: the ring, the access card, even the watch he had once fastened around her wrist with his own hands. Then he spoke loudly enough for all 20 men in the room to hear every word clearly. "Those 2 years meant nothing to me. There are men who choose the cruelest possible way to love, pushing the woman they cherish so far away, hurting her so deeply that no one will ever see her as something worth targeting." But that night, not a single person in that room knew what was truly happening behind Lucian Cross's ice-cold eyes. Nora walked through the iron gates, carrying nothing but unbearable pain and a crushing sense of abandonment, with no one left to call and nowhere left to go. She didn't know that only a few hours earlier, a secret message had reached Lucian from someone the entire family believed had died 2 years ago, and she knew even less that, inside her own body, a new life had just begun, so tiny and so new that even she didn't yet know it was there. 30 minutes before Nora walked into that room, Lucian Cross was still sitting alone beside the third-floor window, an untouched glass of whiskey resting on the table, while the rain tapped steadily against the glass like a countdown only he could hear. The phone on the table began to vibrate, but no number appeared on the screen. In his world, an anonymous call at this hour had never brought good news. Yet tonight he answered anyway, because there were certain calls a man simply wasn't allowed to miss. He pressed the phone to his ear without offering a word of greeting. The other end remained silent for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to send an ordinary man's heart into chaos, and then a voice finally came through, hoarse from having gone unused for far too long, trembling as though the person behind it were struggling to keep himself from falling apart. "Lucian, it's me, it's Ethan." Lucian shot to his feet, one hand gripping the wooden table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. But when he spoke, his voice remained so calm it was almost frightening. "Say that again. Are you really still alive?" There was a long breath of silence on the other end before Ethan continued, his voice still shaking, but every word carefully chosen, as though he had rehearsed this sentence over and over in his mind for the past 2 years. "I'm alive. Richard has kept me under his watch for 2 years, trapped where I couldn't move. I haven't dared send a single signal, because one small mistake would mean someone else dying because of me. But tonight, I found a brief opening, and I can't wait any longer." Lucian responded immediately, not giving him enough time to retreat into silence. "What happened 2 years ago?" Ethan drew in a deep breath before answering, and what he said seemed to pull the entire room into a silence so dense it felt almost solid. "I didn't betray the family. It was Richard. He staged my death from beginning to end, and now I have enough evidence to prove it." Another silence followed, shorter than the first but far heavier, before Ethan spoke again. This time, his voice dropped nearly to a whisper, as though even he were afraid the walls around Lucian might be listening. "There's something else you need to know. Inside your own house, under the very roof where you sleep every night, someone is feeding information to Richard. I don't know who it is yet. You have to be careful. Be careful with everyone." The call ended after exactly 120 seconds, so quickly that Lucian hadn't even been able to ask everything he needed to know, and when the screen went dark, the room was left with nothing but the sound of the rain and his own breathing. He stood there for a very long time, staring down at the courtyard below, where warm yellow light spilled across the wet stones, and inside his mind, everything began rearranging itself into the cold, merciless order that only someone who had survived 20 years in this world could understand. If Richard had been willing to kill his own blood and stage an entire false funeral to conceal the truth, then he wouldn't hesitate to target anyone who mattered to Lucian in order to force him into submission. And the person who mattered most, the only person in the past 2 years who had ever made him set down a glass of whiskey without needing to finish it, was downstairs at that very moment, probably waiting for him to come down to dinner as though this were any other ordinary night. He thought of Nora's face that afternoon, of the way she had looked at him while setting the table, her eyes gentle yet carrying the unmistakable weight of something she wanted to tell him, but hadn't yet found the right moment to say. He would never know what she had planned to tell him that night. In Lucian's mind, only 2 paths remained, and both demanded a price. If he kept her close and surrounded her with 10 men, 20 men, then the entire city would immediately understand that this woman was Lucian Cross's only weakness, and once the informant inside the house passed that information along, she wouldn't survive 6 months. But if he pushed her far away, if he did it cruelly enough, publicly enough, viciously enough, that no one could possibly believe she had ever meant anything to him, then Richard, a man who calculated every move according to value and advantage, would cross her name off the list of pieces worth hunting. 20 minutes passed in that silence, and when the clock reached the exact moment Lucian had set for himself, he knew there was no choice left except the cruelest one. He reached for the intercom, and when his voice came through, it had changed completely. It was no longer the voice of the man who had just stood silently beside the window. It was the voice of the man who ruled an entire criminal empire, cold and unyielding as steel. Bring Nora to my room now, and bring everyone in this house up here, every single person, no exceptions. That night, in the room on the 3rd floor of the mansion that appeared on no map, Lucian Cross did the cruelest thing he had ever done in his life. He stood in the middle of 20 men who served under him, looked directly at the woman who had been by his side for nearly 2 years, and declared that she meant nothing to him. He forced her to leave everything behind, the ring, the access card, even the watch he had once fastened around her wrist with his own hands, then coldly cast her out of his life beneath the pounding rain. Not one person in that room that night understood why a man who had always controlled everything had suddenly abandoned the woman he loved with such merciless cruelty, and no one knew that behind those ice-cold eyes he was hiding something even she knew nothing about. The iron gate closed behind Nora with a hard, lifeless sound, and that was the last sound Lucian heard from her that night. He stood beside the 3rd floor window, staring down at the soaked street where her figure was slowly disappearing beneath the yellow streetlights, her steps never once turning back. He watched until she passed the 1st row of houses, then the 2nd, until her small figure finally vanished completely into the rain and the darkness beneath the trees, and even when there was nothing left to see, he remained there, his eyes fixed on the exact place where she had disappeared, as though if he stared long enough, she might come back. She didn't. Behind him, the room was empty now. The 20 men had gone downstairs one by one as ordered, leaving only the things he had forced her to surrender resting on the wooden table, the access card, the ring, and the watch he had once placed around her wrist with his own hands not so long ago. He didn't touch any of them. His right hand, the one still gripping the edge of the window frame, began to tremble. It was a small tremor, but unmistakable, lasting exactly 3 seconds before he clenched his hand into a fist and forced himself to stand still. 3 seconds, no more. That was all the weakness Lucian Cross allowed himself that night. The door opened without a knock, and the woman who entered was the only person in the organization who had the right to do so. Margaret Collins had managed the family's legitimate businesses for more than a decade, and she was also the only person Lucian trusted enough to give an assignment that could never be written down on any document. She stopped a few steps away from him and waited, because she had learned long ago that when Lucian was silent, it was always better not to speak first. He turned around, his face already restored to its familiar coldness, but Margaret, who had worked beside him long enough to understand what lay beneath that mask, saw something in his eyes that had broken for an instant, before being forced back down almost immediately. He spoke in a low, steady voice, as though he were issuing a tactical order rather than speaking about something deeply personal. "I need you to find someone. She just left this house with no money, no documents, and no one to rely on. You'll find her within the next few weeks, and from that point forward, you'll be the only person watching her." Margaret nodded without asking why. She asked only how he wanted it done. "I need to know what you want me to do once I find her." Lucian turned away again and looked toward the dark window, and when he continued, there was a brief pause before each sentence, as though he were creating the rules for himself at that very moment. "You can't let her know anyone is watching her. There can't be a single trace. If she needs work, create an opportunity, but she has to earn it through her own ability, not because someone handed it to her. If she runs into real trouble, you can help, but only enough to get her through it. Don't go too far. Don't make it constant. If someone is living an ordinary life and suddenly everything starts going strangely well, she'll begin to suspect something, and if she starts to suspect something, my enemies might start asking questions too." Margaret committed every word to memory and nodded slowly. "How often should I report to you?" Lucian answered immediately, without the slightest hesitation. "Keep a close watch, but keep the reports brief. You don't need to give me details. You don't need to describe anything at length. I only need to know where she is, whether she's doing all right, and whether she's safe. That's enough." Margaret lowered her head in acknowledgement, and before turning to leave, she looked at the man standing with his back to her, the man whose name made the entire city lower its voice whenever it was spoken, and for the first time in many years, she didn't see a crime lord in the way he stood there. She saw only a man doing everything he could not to lose the one thing he still had left to hold on to. The door closed behind her, leaving Lucian Cross alone with the empty room, the watch lying motionless on the table, and a weight that he didn't yet know would last for 2 full years. 1 month after that rainy night, Nora Bennett was standing in a small rented room on the outskirts of a city hundreds of miles from the place where she had once lived. A room she had managed to find with the little money she had borrowed from a kind woman she met on the night bus during her first evening away. She stood inside the cramped bathroom, her hand trembling as she held a pregnancy test in her palm, and when 2 clear pink lines appeared across the small plastic stick, she didn't cry right away. She simply stood there with her back pressed against the cold wall, staring at those 2 lines as though she were looking at a sentence being handed down, until her legs finally gave way and she sank onto the tiled floor, both hands wrapping around her stomach, where there was still nothing she could physically feel except for a truth that had just shattered open inside her. In her mind, the memories of that rainy night returned in fragments. Lucian's cold eyes, the words he had spoken loudly enough for the entire room to hear, that the 2 years they had spent together had meant nothing, and the sound of the iron gate closing behind her. She thought about how she had walked out of that life with nothing in her hands, not a single dollar, not one family member to turn to, and now she was about to carry a tiny new life with her into a future that didn't even offer her one stable place to call home. For one brief moment, she thought about making a phone call, just one call, to tell that man that he was going to have a child, but then she remembered the way he had looked at her that night, the way he hadn't looked at her even once while she knelt before him and begged, and she understood that if she called him now, what she might receive in return could be nothing more than a silence, even crueler than the words he had spoken that night. She wiped away her tears, stood up, looked at herself in the mirror hanging on the wall with one corner cracked, and spoke quietly to her own reflection, her voice soft but steady, like a vow. You threw me out with nothing. You didn't let me take a single thing that belonged to you. Fine. Then I'll keep the one thing you never even knew you gave me, and I'll raise this child by myself. You'll never know this child exists. She placed both hands over her stomach again, but this time it wasn't out of panic. It was with a quiet determination that was slowly beginning to take shape inside her, and from that moment forward, Nora Bennett knew she wasn't allowed to fall apart again. Hundreds of miles away, inside the office at the headquarters of the front company, where Margaret Collins still worked every day, Margaret placed her phone on the desk after receiving a report from the person she had quietly positioned near the area where Nora was temporarily staying. The report contained only a few short lines, exactly as Lucian had instructed, but one detail made Margaret read it twice before she could believe what she was seeing. That night, she called Lucian according to their regular reporting schedule, keeping her voice as calm as she possibly could. I have something to report. She's all right. She's found a temporary place to stay, and it looks like she's trying to find work. Lucian answered with nothing more than a dry acknowledgement, the same way he always did whenever he received one of these reports, but Margaret knew she wasn't finished. She drew in a breath and continued, choosing each word with great care because she understood the weight of what she was about to say. There's something else. She's pregnant. The other end of the line went completely silent. There wasn't a sound, not even the trace of a breath, and the silence lasted so long that Margaret finally had to ask whether he was still there. A long time passed before Lucian's voice came through again, so low she could barely hear it, and there was something in that voice that seemed to break and be forced back down at the exact same time. Say that again? Margaret repeated the sentence exactly as she had said it before, without adding or removing a single word, and this time the silence on the other end lasted even longer, long enough for her to wonder whether the call had been disconnected. Finally, Lucian said only one more sentence before ending the call, and his voice no longer sounded like that of a crime lord giving orders. It sounded like the voice of a man who had just realized he had lost far more than he had ever imagined. Don't tell me anything else. Just let me know she's all right. That's enough. That night, in the third-floor room of the mansion that appeared on no map, Lucian Cross sat alone beside the window for a very long time, and for the first time since the rainy night 1 month earlier, the glass on the table remained untouched, without a single drop of whiskey ever being poured. 7 months after the night she stood before that cracked mirror, Nora Bennett was moving more heavily with each passing day through the cramped rented room she had already changed twice since arriving in this city, each new place a little cheaper than the last, so she could save whatever she could for what was coming. She worked until the very last days when her body could still keep her on her feet, clearing tables at a small diner during the day and taking on extra work in the evenings, repairing the bindings and records of old books for a nearby antique shop. The shop owner had no idea that the quiet young woman working there had once been the only person trusted with the complete financial records of one of the most powerful families in another city. On the night the pain began, rain was falling again, as though fate had deliberately chosen to repeat the exact weather of the night she had been cast out 1 year earlier. She called a taxi by herself, made the final painful steps into the emergency department of the county hospital by herself, and when a nurse handed her the admission form and asked her to write down the name of an emergency contact, Nora held the pen and stared at the empty space for a very long time. She thought of Lucian's cold face. She thought about the fact that there was no one else left in the world for her to call. In the end, she left the space blank, signed her own name on the final line, and handed the form back to the nurse without saying another word. Her delivery didn't go as smoothly as the doctors had reassured her it would during her prenatal appointments. Her uterus wasn't contracting strongly enough, Labor continued for more than 12 hours, and by the time the baby was born, postpartum hemorrhaging began so suddenly that the entire medical team had to call for additional help. She lost nearly 1.5 liters of blood that night, almost 1/4 of the amount normally carried in the body of an adult, and her blood pressure dropped to a dangerously low level, causing the monitor beside her bed to sound one alarm after another. The procedure to stop the bleeding lasted 2 hours and 10 minutes, and throughout those 2 hours and 10 minutes, no one's name was called outside the operating room, no one sat waiting in the hallway, and no hand held hers before she slipped into the darkness brought on by sedation. When Nora woke, morning light was already slipping through the hospital window, and the night nurse, a middle-aged woman who had witnessed more births than she could possibly count over the course of her career, stood beside the bed looking at her with an expression filled with both sympathy and quiet sorrow. She gently asked Nora whether she was certain there was no one she could call, no family member, not even a friend, who could come and take her and the baby home. Nora looked down at the child being placed in her arms for the first time, a tiny baby girl whose delicate fingers were curling softly around one of hers, and it took her a long while before she could answer. Her voice was hoarse from exhaustion after the endless night. "There's no one. It's just me and her." The nurse didn't ask anything else. She simply nodded and rested a gentle hand on Nora's shoulder before leaving, allowing her to remain alone in the small room with her newborn daughter. Nora looked at her child for a long time, counting every tiny finger and every tiny toe, and for the first time since the rainy night the year before, something warm began to find its way through the thick layer of ice that had sealed around her heart for the past 7 months. She named her daughter Wren, a name she had chosen long before the birth, simply because it belonged to a tiny bird that could still sing loudly in the bitterest winter. She lowered her head and pressed her forehead against her daughter's, whispering the first words she ever spoke to the child, with all the strength remaining in a body that had just survived a night spent dangerously close to death. "I'm sorry you had to come into this world in a room where no one was waiting for us. But I promise you, from today on, I'll never let you be as lonely as I once was." 3 days later, when she was discharged, Nora carried her daughter out through the hospital doors by herself. There was no one waiting to pick them up, no flowers, no car waiting outside, only a taxi she had called herself, with money she had earned on her own. She sat in the back seat, holding her daughter tightly against her chest and looking through the window as the unfamiliar city began another new day, telling herself that this was the lowest point she would ever reach, and from now on, the only direction left was upward. What Nora never knew was that half of the hospital bill she should have been forced to carry alone had already been paid before she even reached the cashier. The employee at the desk simply told her that the hospital had a financial assistance fund for mothers in difficult circumstances, and that she could pay the remaining balance gradually over the months ahead. It was an explanation reasonable enough that, exhausted and desperate only to take her baby home, Nora didn't suspect a thing. She believed the explanation. She silently thanked some anonymous charity fund whose name she assumed she would never know, and then she walked away without looking back. She couldn't possibly have known that the money hadn't come from any hospital assistance fund at all, but had been quietly arranged by a woman acting on instructions sent from hundreds of miles away, instructions consisting of only a few words, telling her to take care of Nora just enough to make sure she survived the night, but under no circumstances let her realize that someone was still watching over her. And because of that exact instruction, only half of the hospital bill was paid, enough to lighten the burden on the shoulders of a young mother who had just survived a night dangerously close to death, but not enough to make her ask a single question. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, Nora walked into a small shop hidden along an old cobblestone street with Wren in her arms, beneath a faded sign that read "Antique Ceramic Restoration." She hadn't come there by accident. During the days she spent in the hospital, She had heard one of the nurses mention that this shop often needed people with careful, skilled hands, and Nora, who had spent years learning the art of kintsugi from her late grandmother, the technique of repairing broken pottery with liquid gold so that the cracks became part of its beauty rather than flaws that needed to be hidden, believed this might be the only opportunity she still had left to hold on to. The woman sitting behind the counter that day was Margaret Collins, wearing a different name on the employee badge pinned to her chest and playing the role of a regional manager for the parent company who regularly visited the smaller stores in its antique business chain. Margaret had known in advance that Nora would come. She had known every step Nora had taken for months, but her face revealed no trace of that familiarity. She looked at Nora with the eyes of a manager evaluating a complete stranger and asked where she had done this kind of work before, how long she had been doing it, and whether she had brought anything that could demonstrate her skill. Nora placed a small bowl on the counter, one she had restored with her own hands in the rented room during sleepless nights when her baby wouldn't stop crying. Fine golden lines, delicate as threads, ran along the old fractures, joining the broken pieces into a new form, beautiful in a way that no untouched object could ever equal. Margaret picked up the bowl and slowly turned it beneath the light for a long time, and in that moment, she was no longer pretending to be a manager. She was genuinely astonished by what she was seeing. She set the bowl down, looked directly into Nora's eyes, and spoke with the calm, practical tone of a businesswoman, not with the voice of someone offering charity. "Your work is much better than the craftsman we let go last month. If you want the position, you can start tomorrow. You'll be paid by the piece. The more you complete, the more you earn." Nora accepted immediately, and something rose inside her that she hadn't felt in many months. It wasn't gratitude for being pitied. It was a quiet sense of pride, because she had earned this with her own hands, without depending on anyone. Over the months that followed, Nora worked with such determination that even Margaret, despite already knowing the story behind this woman, couldn't help being surprised every time she stopped by to check on the shop. Nora took additional work home at night, carrying Ren against her back while her hands carefully blended each drop of liquid gold into the cracks of an antique vase, and within only 6 months, word began spreading beyond that narrow street about a young craftswoman with unusually gifted hands. Customers from farther neighborhoods began coming specifically to ask her to restore precious family heirlooms. On one occasion, a wealthy customer was so moved after receiving a restored vase that he opened his wallet and offered Nora a large amount of extra money beyond the agreed price. But she quietly pushed the additional money back toward him and kept only the exact amount listed on the invoice. The customer, surprised, asked her why. Nora simply smiled faintly and answered with a sentence she had repeated to herself countless times since the night she stood before the cracked mirror in her first rented room. "I only take what my own hands earn, nothing more." Margaret stood in the corner of the shop and witnessed the entire exchange, and that evening, when she sat down to prepare her regular report for Lucian, she wrote only one short line, just as she always did, a single sentence saying that Nora was standing on her own through the work of her own hands, and Margaret believed that those words, though the distant man would never say so aloud, brought him more relief than any other report she had sent during the entire past year. While Nora, hundreds of miles away, was slowly learning to stand firmly on her own feet again, a private meeting was taking place at the headquarters where Lucian continued to run the family's criminal empire day after day, inside a basement room with no windows and no phone signal capable of reaching it. The man standing across from Lucian that night was Cole, the bodyguard who had been with him since the early days before he had taken control, the only person besides Margaret who knew part of the truth about Ethan's secret phone call 2 years earlier. For the past year, the trail leading to the informant had gone no further than the brief warning Ethan had given on that first night, that somewhere inside Lucian's own house, Someone was secretly passing information to Richard, and no one in the organization, not even Lucian himself, had been able to determine exactly who it was. Lucian understood that as long as that person's identity remained hidden, every plan he built to bring Richard down could be destroyed from within before it ever had a chance to begin. He gave Cole an assignment unlike anything he had asked of him before. It wasn't about standing guard with a weapon. It wasn't about escorting anyone. It was about quietly examining the entire organization from the inside, reviewing the access history for every critical area of the mansion, comparing system access times against the moments when confidential information had leaked outside, and searching for anything unusual, no matter how small, among the hundreds of people who moved through the property every day. Lucian looked at Cole, his voice low and heavy, as though he were placing the most valuable thing he still possessed into another man's hands. This doesn't require strength. It requires absolute patience. If you find him, don't act too quickly, because if we take him immediately, we'll lose the chance to learn what else he's still sending out, and we'll lose the chance to follow him far enough to find out who's really pulling the strings. Cole nodded, fully understanding the danger of remaining close to a traitor without being allowed to reveal that his identity had already been uncovered. I understand. Let him keep believing he's safe. Over the months that followed, Cole quietly narrowed the field of suspicion, reconstructing every timeline and comparing every shift, until eventually he found a name. A man who had served on the internal security team for many years and had permission to enter the records room without having to report it. Cole didn't arrest him immediately, just as Lucian had instructed from the beginning. Instead, he chose to watch him in silence, allowing the man to continue believing that his identity remained undiscovered, and during that time, Cole gradually gathered more concrete evidence. Each occasion when the informant copied confidential documents, each time he secretly transmitted information through a carefully disguised communication channel. Then, late one weekend night, when most of the people in the mansion had already gone to rest, Cole discovered the informant attempting to access an especially sensitive data file directly connected to Lucian's plan to bring Richard down, a plan Lucian had kept under absolute secrecy, and Cole understood that this was the final piece of evidence he needed to complete his report. But just as Cole moved closer to record what was happening, one small mistake, perhaps a sound, perhaps a reflection of his eyes in the computer screen, caused the informant to realize someone was standing behind him. He turned around, and in that moment of direct confrontation, both men understood that there was no longer any way back for either of them. The informant, knowing that his identity had been completely exposed, had nothing left to lose, and during the brief struggle that broke out inside that dark records room, Cole never got the chance to return and report to Lucian as he had done throughout all those months. No one else witnessed what truly happened inside that room that night, and the story doesn't need to be told in any greater detail. It is enough to know that the following morning, when one of Lucian's assistants entered the records area during a scheduled inspection, he found what no one had wanted to find, and the news was immediately carried straight to the third floor, to the man who was still waiting for a report that would now never come. The terrible news reached Lucian early the following morning, when an assistant entered the records area during a scheduled inspection and found what no one had wanted to find. Lucian received the call before dawn had fully broken, and in the first moment after hearing the news, he didn't strike the table, didn't shout, didn't do any of the things people might imagine a crime lord would do after losing one of his most trusted men. He simply remained seated beside the third-floor window, his hands folded together on the table, silent enough that Margaret, who hurried there as soon as she heard what had happened, stopped at the doorway because she didn't dare speak first. Cole had died on the very night he reached the final piece of evidence, but he hadn't died empty-handed. In the hours before that fateful struggle, Cole had managed to copy the entire confidential file the informant had been preparing to send outside, then secretly transmitted it through the private communication channel known only to him and Lucian, just a few hours before his presence was discovered. Because of that, even though Cole was gone, what he had left behind remained intact, waiting on Lucian's desk like the final legacy of a bodyguard who had given everything, including his life, to complete his mission. Lucian opened the file and read every line beneath the warm yellow light, and he immediately understood the value of what he was holding. It wasn't only evidence of the informant's betrayal. It also contained crucial links exposing the hidden financial networks Richard had spent more than a decade carefully concealing, the final pieces Lucian had been missing throughout the past year as he worked to complete the picture of his rival's empire. He rose from his chair and walked toward Margaret, his voice roughened by grief, but every word as firm as steel. Cole didn't die for nothing. The man who did this was Silas Brandt, the head of the internal security shift, someone I once trusted enough to give access to the records room. He's been exposed, and he knows he's been exposed. Sure enough, that very morning, Silas Brandt realized that the atmosphere around him had changed. The glances lingered longer, footsteps seemed to draw closer than usual, and with the instincts of a man who had spent years living in suspicion, he understood that his time had run out. He gathered what he could in a hurry, left the mansion through the rear exit he often used to avoid the security cameras, then drove straight out of the city, hoping to disappear before Lucian had time to close the net around him. But a man like Lucian Cross never allowed his prey to get very far. Exactly 2 hours after Cole's body was discovered in the records room, Silas Brandt's car was forced to stop at a small gas station in a deserted area outside the city, where he intended to fill the tank before continuing his escape. He never made it any farther. What truly happened at that isolated gas station that night was never known by anyone outside the organization, and the story itself doesn't need to describe it in greater detail. It is enough to know that by the following morning, Silas Brandt would never again pose a threat to anyone, and the line of communication he had maintained with Richard for so many months had been severed completely. That sudden and unnatural silence caused Richard's entire intelligence operation to hesitate, to grow suspicious, and to become more cautious about every movement around it. But there was one thing Lucian couldn't possibly have anticipated, and it was something he would pay dearly for later. During the final days before Cole discovered him, Silas Brandt had somehow managed to uncover a clue that should never have been allowed to leak. A name and a small city where a woman was quietly raising her child with nothing but the work of her own hands. And before fleeing the mansion that night, he had managed to send that clue away, placing it directly into Richard's hands. From that moment on, Richard possessed a piece on the board that neither Lucian nor Nora even knew existed. That morning, as Lucian stood silently beside the window and mourned a brother who had fallen because of him, he still couldn't know that Cole's death hadn't only taken away one of the rare men who had remained truly loyal to him. It had also opened a small breach, allowing the danger he had spent nearly 2 years keeping far away to begin creeping back toward him in silence, this time aimed directly at the people he loved most. In the private study buried deep within his estate, Richard read the final message Silas Brandt had sent before disappearing, completely unaware that it truly would be the last message he ever received from him. When all contact with his man inside Lucian's mansion suddenly vanished in the days that followed, Richard initially assumed Silas had simply gone into hiding after some unexpected incident, and he didn't immediately consider the worst possibility. It took time, and several scattered reports from other sources before he gradually confirmed that the loyal informant who had served him for so long was gone for good, and that sudden silence forced Richard to slow down and move more carefully with every decision that followed. But even though Silas was gone, the final piece of information he had managed to send remained just as valuable, giving Richard exactly what he needed: a name, a city, and a lead on a woman he quickly recognized as the same woman Lucian Cross had publicly cast aside in front of 20 witnesses nearly 2 years earlier. Richard read the information over and over again, and at first he didn't consider it a particularly valuable card to hold. In his memory, and in the memory of the entire city, the story of the woman named Nora Bennett had ended on that rainy night when Lucian stood among 20 of his men and declared that the 2 years they had spent together had meant nothing. A man like Lucian Cross didn't reveal weakness easily, and the way he had treated her that night had been so cruel that no one, not even Richard, a man suspicious of nearly everything, could believe it had all been an act. Richard ordered one of his trusted men to watch her quietly from a distance, not to act right away, but simply to verify the truth, to see whether this woman was really living the broken life the entire city believed she was. During the first several months of surveillance, the reports that reached Richard showed nothing more than a woman living alone, raising a child by herself in a cramped rented room, with no obvious support from anyone, no visits from Lucian, and no visible contact from anyone connected to his organization. Through the eyes of a man who always calculated value before taking action, Richard concluded that the woman had truly been abandoned, a piece that had lost its usefulness and wasn't worth spending more resources on while he was already pouring all his attention into resisting the increasingly tight pressure Lucian was quietly building around him. He set the information aside for the time being, storing it in a corner of his mind as a possible backup rather than an immediate priority, and focused all his efforts on strengthening the weakened links within his own organization after Silas Brandt's death. But time, which never belongs to anyone, quietly began revealing things Richard hadn't expected. Nearly a year later, as routine surveillance reports continued to arrive, a few details began drawing his attention back to Nora. She was no longer living in the same desperate circumstances. She had moved into a better place. Her work restoring antiques had begun earning a certain level of respect among collectors, and most importantly, several substantial sums of money had appeared in her account during the most difficult periods of her life, amounts that didn't match what she normally earned from that kind of work, even though they had been carefully disguised as bonuses from some front company. Richard, whose suspicious nature ran too deeply to ignore such things, began asking questions. A woman who had truly been abandoned had no reason to receive help that arrived so precisely at the worst possible moments, unless someone, no matter how careful or hidden, had still been watching over her and quietly supporting her from the shadows. He sat alone in his study for a long time, piecing together every fragment of information gathered over nearly 2 years, and for the first time, a cold smile appeared on his face. He realized that he had nearly overlooked the most valuable piece in the entire game, a piece Lucian Cross had gone to such extraordinary lengths to protect that the protection itself had become the clearest proof of how much she truly mattered to him. Richard summoned his most trusted man into the room and ordered him to increase the surveillance, not to make a move immediately, but to wait for the right moment. The moment when everything Lucian had spent 2 years building was finally approaching its end, and then this card would be played precisely when it carried the greatest possible value. 3 weeks after the night Lucian learned about Cole, when the funeral had already been held quietly within the organization and everything seemed to have returned to its usual rhythm, Lucian still maintained the same calm exterior in front of everyone, because in his world, a man at the top didn't have the right to let anyone see that he was hurting. But that night, when Margaret sent her usual monthly report, there was something different from every time before. Along with the familiar words saying that Nora was still doing well and still healthy, there was a photograph, something Margaret had allowed herself to send only once during the entire year, on the child's first birthday. It had been taken from a distance, with no details revealing the location or anything in the surroundings. only enough to clearly show the round, smiling face of a little girl whose tiny hands were holding tightly to a small cake with a single candle standing on top. Lucian sat alone in the familiar room beside the third-floor window and opened the photograph. He stared at it for a very long time, long enough that the glass of whiskey resting beside his hand no longer held any warmth. For the first time in nearly 2 years, he was seeing his daughter's face clearly. Not through imagination, not through the dry sentences of a report. It was a real face, a real smile, and eyes with a familiar shape he recognized instantly because they were his mother's eyes, the woman he had lost when he was still very young. He gently touched the screen with one finger, as though that simple gesture might somehow shorten the hundreds of miles separating him from the child, even if only by the smallest amount, and in that moment, everything he had forced himself to suppress during the 3 weeks since Cole's death began rising inside him all at once. He couldn't tell where the grief for a fallen brother ended, where the grief for a daughter he had never held in his arms began, or where the grief for the woman he had pushed out of his own life with his own hands so that she might survive belonged among them. He placed the photograph on the desk, picked up the now cold glass of whiskey, and gripped it so tightly that the veins along his wrist stood out beneath the warm yellow light. The crystal glass, made from thick material designed to withstand considerable pressure, finally couldn't endure the force of his hand and shattered in his palm. Sharp fragments and what little whiskey remained spilled across the wooden desk and slipped between his fingers, but he made no attempt to let go. He didn't make a sound. He simply sat there with his head lowered, and for the first time since the night he stood beside the window watching Nora disappear into the rain nearly 2 years earlier, Lucian Cross allowed his tears to fall, silently and without a sound, as though even at the deepest point of his pain, he still wouldn't permit himself to be loud. He didn't cry for long, perhaps less than 1 minute, but during that brief moment, it seemed as though everything he had held inside for the past 2 years came pouring out at once. Then he lifted his head, wiped away the tears still resting on his cheeks with the sleeve of his shirt, rose from the chair, walked to the sink in the corner of the room, and washed the remaining pieces of broken glass from his hand beneath cold running water. When he returned to the desk, his face had already settled back into the familiar cold expression everyone in the organization knew, except now there was something harder in his eyes, something more determined than at any time before. He picked up the photograph of his daughter, carefully placed it inside a private drawer, and locked it with the key he always carried with him. Then he reached for the phone and called the man responsible for coordinating his forces. When Lucian spoke, there wasn't a trace left of the man who had just been crying alone in the darkness. "Gather everything we got from Cole before he died. I don't need any more time to grieve. Starting tonight, every resource I have goes toward one thing and one thing only: ending Richard as soon as possible." The man on the other end asked whether they should move more cautiously, because Richard was still too powerful to confront in haste. Lucian looked out through the window, where the rain was falling that night exactly as it had 2 years earlier, and he answered with only one sentence, slowly, but with such certainty that no one could question his resolve again. "I've waited long enough. It's time to end all of this, so I can finally go back and bring them home before I lose anything else." From the night the crystal glass shattered in his palm, a new habit began to form in Lucian's life. A small ritual known only to him, repeated every time Margaret's monthly report arrived. He would read each brief line on the screen, and the moment he finished, his hand would automatically reach for the cell phone lying beside him. His thumb would move to Nora's number, the same contact he had kept in his phone for nearly 2 years without ever pressing the call button even once, and every time, his finger would stop directly above it, trembling for a few seconds before he turned off the screen and placed the phone face down on the table, as though simply not seeing it anymore might make the urge disappear as well. That ritual continued faithfully for months, until one night in the middle of the second winter, when Margaret's report arrived carrying something completely different from anything she had sent before. It wasn't the familiar message saying that everything was fine. Instead, it was a short, worried update saying that the child had been running a high fever for 3 straight days, had already been taken to the emergency room once, and that her temperature still hadn't fallen to a safe level even after medication had been given intravenously. Lucian read the message and immediately shot to his feet, a reaction so instinctive that even he couldn't control it, and in that moment, every wall he had spent 2 years building around himself collapsed completely. He strode quickly to the closet, pulled on a heavy coat, then called loudly toward the floor below and ordered that a car be prepared at once. His voice echoed through the hallway with an urgency no one had ever heard from a man who normally kept everything under absolute control. "Get the car ready right now. I need to leave in 10 minutes. The housekeeper standing at the bottom of the staircase looked confused and asked where he intended to go at such an hour, and that simple question was enough to stop Lucian in the middle of his hurried descent. He froze on the 5th step from the top, one hand still gripping the wooden railing, and in his mind, the rule he had made for himself nearly 2 years earlier returned with painful clarity. If one day he knew exactly where she was, there would come a night when he wouldn't be able to control himself, when he would get into a car and go find her, and the night he found her would also be the night she might pay for it with her life. He remained there for a long time, his chest rising and falling as though he had just run a great distance, even though he hadn't yet stepped outside the house, and the battle tearing through him was more brutal than any fight he had ever faced on an actual battlefield. On one side was the image of his daughter lying with a burning fever in some unfamiliar room, without her father beside her, with only a mother sitting awake through the night in fear. On the other side was the cold voice of reason reminding him that the moment he appeared, the moment anyone saw him leave the city at this hour, with panic written across his face, the news would reach Richard faster than anything else, and everything he had sacrificed for the past 2 years would become meaningless. Lucian closed his eyes and tightened both hands around the railing until the wood beneath his palms gave a faint crack, and finally he released it, turned around, and walked back up the stairs, leaving the housekeeper below staring after him in confusion, unable to understand what had just happened. He returned to his room, closed the door, and stood with his back pressed against the wood for a long time, as though the door itself were the only thing still keeping him from rushing out into the darkness. He took out his phone, but he didn't call Nora. Instead, he called Margaret directly, his voice rough from the effort of holding himself together. "Tell me the moment her temperature comes down. I don't care what time it is." Margaret told him she would, and before ending the call, she added one more sentence, a small attempt to comfort the man standing alone in the darkness hundreds of miles away. "She's a very strong mother. The little girl will be all right." Lucian didn't sleep for a single minute that night. He remained in the chair beside the window until the first light of dawn began slipping through the glass, and it wasn't until close to morning, when the message finally appeared on his screen saying that his daughter's temperature had dropped to a safe level, that he allowed his eyes to close. For the first time in many months, sleep came to him not because he was exhausted, but because of a sense of relief he finally allowed himself to feel, even if only for a few brief hours before another day of fighting began. Ren's fever eventually passed, and the spring of the second year arrived carrying a noticeable change in Nora's life. She realized she couldn't keep trying to manage everything alone, between an ever-growing number of restoration orders and caring for a child who was just beginning to learn how to walk, and after many nights of thinking it over, she decided to use part of the money she had saved through months of relentless work to hire a middle-aged woman from the neighborhood to look after Ren during the day. It was the first time since the night she gave birth alone in the hospital that Nora allowed herself to accept help from someone else. But this time, it was help she paid for herself, help she chose for herself, not a favor granted by anyone. With more time available, Nora poured everything she had into her work, and her skill, which had already become known among many customers, began reaching even farther. She was invited to restore a collection of antique ceramics for a small gallery in the region, and when the collection went on display, the golden lines joining the cracks across each piece made more than a few visitors stop and stare for a long time, moved by an art form that transformed damage into beauty. From that small exhibition, Nora's name began to circulate among collectors in neighboring cities, and within only a few months, she was able to open a small restoration studio under her own name and hire 2 assistants, something she wouldn't have dared dream of only a year earlier. On the evening she signed the lease for the studio, Nora stood outside holding Ren in her arms beneath the newly hung wooden sign, and at that very moment, the child, who was nearly a year and a half old, suddenly reached both tiny hands toward her and babbled the first clear sound of her life that Nora immediately recognized as a word. Mama. Nora froze in the middle of the street, pulled her daughter tightly against her chest, and the tears she had held back through so many difficult months suddenly spilled without restraint, not from pain, but from a pure happiness she had never imagined she could still feel so completely. A few weeks later, one afternoon in the studio while Nora was bent over her work, she heard a faint clattering sound behind her. When she turned around, she saw Ren standing unsteadily while holding onto the leg of a table. Then the little girl let go and took the first uncertain steps of her life across the short stretch of wooden floor before falling into her mother's open arms. Nora held her close, laughing through tears, and in that moment, all the loneliness of the night she had given birth with no family beside her, all the weight of the months she had struggled through alone, seemed to soften beneath the tenderness of these small milestones, milestones that she, and she alone, had been there to witness from beginning to end. Hundreds of miles away, in the third-floor room where Lucian still spent most of his time, an important meeting was underway, not in the sealed basement as before, but inside the very room that had witnessed all of his pain over the past 2 years. Spread across the table were documents his team had worked tirelessly to gather over that long period of time, with the most important foundation being the confidential file Cole had traded his life to copy and send back before he died, combined with the brief fragments of information Ethan still risked sending whenever a rare opportunity appeared. Everything had now gradually been arranged into a chain of connections that was almost complete, enough to expose each illegal financial network and every hidden relationship Richard had worked for more than a decade to conceal. Lucian understood that even with all the evidence in his hands, he still couldn't confront a power equal to Richard's head-on. An open war would inflict devastating losses on both sides and bring consequences no one could predict, so the plan had to be far more subtle. Richard's empire had to collapse from within before he even realized he was being surrounded. But there was one thing that forced Lucian to weigh every move with almost suffocating caution. Ethan was still in Richard's hands, imprisoned and watched for the past 2 years, held like a final piece of leverage to control Lucian himself. Every step forward in the plan forced Lucian to calculate how he could bring Richard down while also keeping his only remaining sworn brother alive, because he knew all too well that a man like Richard wouldn't hesitate to use that final piece the moment he was pushed into a corner. Lucian stood alone before the map of Richard's power network, covered with red threads connecting one link to another, almost complete now, lacking only a few final details before everything could be tightened at once. He remained there for a very long time, looking at the map like a general studying the final battlefield of a war that had already lasted 2 years, and in his mind there was no image stronger than the hope that one day soon, when everything that needed to end had finally ended, he would be able to step out of the darkness and bring Ethan, along with the people he loved most, back home, not through brief reports or faded photographs passed through someone else, but with his own hands. One early summer morning, inside the secret office where Richard still managed his private surveillance network, a report was placed on his desk that made him stop whatever he was doing. No one in his organization could explain exactly how the clue had been pieced together. All they knew was that from the scattered surveillance data gathered over nearly 2 years, a faint thread had slowly begun to emerge, connecting the woman who managed the antique shop chain where Nora had once worked to the legitimate financial division of Lucian Cross's empire. Richard sat silently in his chair, fitting each piece of information together, and a slow smile spread across his lips as everything gradually became clear. It hadn't been a coincidence that a woman who had supposedly been completely abandoned received help at exactly the moments when she needed it most. It hadn't been a coincidence that the manager of that shop had appeared at precisely the moment Nora needed an opportunity to get back on her feet. An invisible hand had been watching over her and supporting her from the shadows, and now Richard had finally found the thread leading back to that hand. He ordered his men to begin closing in, not by targeting Nora directly at first, but by probing the people around Margaret, trying to determine whether anyone else knew about the connection. During that investigation, one of Richard's men managed to approach Margaret at a business networking event and asked a few seemingly harmless questions about the front company she was managing. Margaret, with years of experience operating in the shadows, immediately sensed something unusual in the way the man was questioning her, and that very evening she placed an urgent call to Lucian, her voice showing a rare loss of composure. "I think someone is trying to trace me. They may have started to suspect there's a connection between me and her." Lucian shot to his feet the moment he heard those words, and in that instant he understood that the thing he had feared most for nearly 2 years had finally begun to happen. He pressed her for answers, his voice more urgent than at any time since the night he learned his daughter had a high fever. "How much do they know? Has anyone followed you all the way back yet?" Margaret told him she couldn't be certain, but she would immediately change every route she used, cut off all direct contact with the area where Nora lived, and keep only the indirect support channel that had already been carefully disguised, hidden well enough that no one could trace it backward to its source. She reassured him that Nora was still safe for the moment, because Nora had long since become independent and no longer relied on any kind of assistance significant enough to leave an obvious trail. But that temporary safety only made Lucian even more unable to remain still, because he understood that once Richard had managed to get close enough to Margaret, finding Nora was only a matter of time. He remained silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had hardened into a firm decision. "We don't have time to wait for the perfect moment anymore. If he's picked up the scent, then every day that passes is another day he gets closer to her. I need every final piece in position sooner than planned. We have to bring him down before he has the chance to reach them." After ending the call, Lucian stood alone in the room, and for the first time since he had built the entire plan, he felt the full weight of time pressing down on his shoulders. For nearly 2 years, he had patiently woven every strand of the net, slowly and carefully, making sure that when he finally made his move, Richard would have no opening left to turn the game around. But now, that patience had become a luxury he could no longer afford. He stood beside the third-floor window, looking out into the still darkness beyond, and in his mind, Nora's face and Wren's smile in the photograph he still kept locked inside the drawer appeared more clearly than ever, along with one cold, unwavering determination. He would end everything before the storm he had worked so hard to keep far away could finally reach the people he loved most. In the days that followed, Lucian poured every resource he had into accelerating the final stages of the plan, urgently completing the chain of evidence Cole had paid for with his life, and arranging every piece so that, when the moment came, Richard's empire would collapse from within. But there was one thing that continued to weigh heavily on Lucian and forced him to calculate every move with extreme caution. Ethan, his only remaining brother, had spent the past 2 years under Richard's control. After staging Ethan's fake death to remove him from everyone's sight, Richard hadn't killed him. Instead, he kept him alive as a backup piece, an invisible chain to use if he ever needed leverage over Lucian himself. Ethan was kept under house arrest, watched at every step, and throughout all that time, the only thing he could do was quietly send out a few brief messages whenever a rare opportunity appeared, just enough to let Lucian know he was still alive and to warn him about the existence of the informant, but never enough to risk doing anything more. Because of that, in Lucian's entire plan, Ethan wasn't a piece he could simply move into position. He was someone Lucian had to rely on for information while also protecting with the greatest possible care, because the moment Richard suspected that Ethan was communicating with the outside world, Ethan's life would end immediately. Lucian understood that once he moved against Richard, Ethan's fate would become more fragile than ever, because a man like Richard wouldn't hesitate to use his final piece of leverage when cornered, and that knowledge forced Lucian to weigh every step with almost suffocating caution. Meanwhile, Richard wasn't sitting still either. After approaching Margaret and failing to extract anything more, then noticing that every direct connection around her had suddenly become far more tightly guarded, he understood that the other side had begun taking precautions, and that only strengthened his suspicion that the woman truly mattered. Unable to continue tracing the trail through Margaret, Richard changed tactics and ordered a small team to go directly to the town where Nora was living, not to act immediately, but to observe her current life with their own eyes and gather information from the scene itself instead of relying on indirect reports that could no longer be trusted. For 3 straight days, those men moved quietly through the small street where Nora's restoration studio stood, posing as customers, posing as curious passers-by, and what they discovered was completely different from the image of an abandoned woman living in hardship that Richard had believed for nearly 2 years. They saw a well-established restoration studio bearing her own name, filled with praise from respected collectors. They saw her coming and going each day with the confidence of a true owner, with employees of her own and customers traveling from distant cities specifically to seek out her work. And most importantly, they saw a little girl who was almost always close beside her, carrying features so strangely familiar that anyone who had ever met Lucian Cross could recognize them immediately. The report reached Richard that same afternoon, and when he finished reading every line, he rose from his chair and walked to the window of his office. For the first time in many years, something almost resembling genuine excitement began to stir inside a man who normally kept every emotion sealed beneath absolute coldness. The woman had never truly been abandoned. The entire brutal performance on that rainy night had been nothing more than an elaborate disguise Lucian Cross had created to protect the most precious thing in his life, a child whose existence, perhaps even some of his closest people, had never known about. Richard immediately understood the true value of the card he had just uncovered. It wasn't only a woman, it was the one fatal weakness of a man who had gone 2 full years without revealing a single opening in the hidden war between them. He summoned his most trusted man into the room, stood before a map of the town where Nora lived that had been hung on the wall, and when he spoke, his voice carried a chilling decisiveness. "Prepare the men, prepare the vehicles, gather the force, and move toward that town immediately. I don't need any more reports. I need action." His trusted man asked whether they should wait a little longer to be more certain of the situation. because the other side still had no idea they had been discovered. Richard smiled, a smile so cold it seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. That's exactly why this is the perfect moment. Lucian Cross has hidden this piece for 2 years. I'm not giving him one more second to prepare a defense. What Richard didn't know, when he ordered most of his trusted forces toward that small town, was that the decision had accidentally created an opening inside the very heart of his own headquarters, where Ethan had been held for the past 2 years, an opening the quick-witted younger brother had been waiting a very long time to seize. 3 days after Richard's team secretly set out, the atmosphere inside the headquarters where Ethan had been held for 2 long years suddenly began to feel different. Most of the familiar guards had disappeared without warning. Hurried footsteps echoed through the hallways, and through the narrow opening of his room, Ethan realized that nearly all of Richard's most trusted forces were being redirected toward a single destination. During 2 years under constant control, he had learned how to become invisible, how to listen for the smallest sounds, and how to memorize every habit of the men assigned to watch him, and he understood that an opportunity like this might never come again. Pressing himself against the wall near the corridor, Ethan listened to fragments of conversation drifting from the few men who remained, and word by word, the picture began to take shape with a clarity that sent a chill down his spine. Richard had found the place where his sister was hiding, had discovered the existence of the child, and was now personally leading men toward that small town to play the final card against Lucian. Ethan didn't allow himself even 1 second of hesitation. With the remaining guards stretched thinner than ever, he used everything he had quietly prepared over the past 2 years, slipped through the blind spots he had memorized, and escaped from his confinement that very night. Once outside, the first thing he did was find a way to contact Lucian urgently, ignoring every safety rule they had followed for so long. On the other end, Lucian answered with immediate caution, because a direct call at that hour had never happened before. But the moment he realized the caller was his younger brother, the man who was supposed to still be in Richard's hands, he understood at once that something serious had happened. Ethan didn't waste a second on greetings. He went straight to the point, speaking so quickly that the words nearly collided with one another. "I got out, but you need to listen to me. Richard is personally leading men toward Nora. They'll reach her in about 90 minutes if they keep moving at their current speed." Lucian shot to his feet, and every careful plan he had spent 2 years building suddenly compressed into a single moment. In his mind, the image of his little daughter and the woman he had never stopped thinking about overwhelmed the cold logic he had always relied on. But he knew there was no time to panic. The fact that Richard was personally leading the operation also meant he had left his headquarters behind, creating the very opening Lucian had been waiting 2 years to see. Lucian ordered every prepared unit into motion, including the private tactical team that had remained on standby for precisely this opportunity, and at the same time, he activated the entire chain of evidence they had spent 2 years assembling. There was no longer any time to wait for the perfect moment. He called the people he trusted most, his voice hardening into a series of absolute commands. "Bring everything into the open now. Send every document to Richard's partners, to every remaining link in his organization. I need him to lose every source of support tonight, before his people can reach my sister." In less than half an hour after the evidence was released, everything Richard had spent more than a decade hiding was exposed before the eyes of those who had once stood beside him, from the false death he had arranged for a member of his own family, to the money he had stolen, to the people he had quietly removed in order to strengthen his control. Richard's organization began shaking from within almost immediately. Even the most loyal figures started to waver. Some of his closest people hurried to distance themselves in order to save their own lives and positions, and panicked calls began pouring into Richard's phone while he was still on the road toward the small town. But the team he had sent ahead continued following its original orders, completely unaware that the empire behind them was collapsing piece by piece. There were 45 minutes left before they reached their destination, and inside the small town, Nora was still working in her restoration studio as though it were any other ordinary afternoon, completely unaware of the storm drawing closer with every passing minute. Not far away, Lucian, Ethan, and the rest of their team had left the moment the call ended, pushing their vehicles as fast as they safely could, but the navigation screen inside the car still showed more than 100 kilometers between them and the town, a distance that would be almost impossible to close before Richard's men arrived. Lucian repeatedly called the people he had quietly positioned near the area long ago, men whose only assignment until then had been to observe from a distance and who had never been ordered to intervene directly, and for the first time, he told them to act immediately, to do whatever they could to delay the approaching convoy, even if they could buy only a few precious minutes. Meanwhile, behind Richard, as report after report arrived describing the collapse of his entire network, he was forced to stop along the road, torn between continuing toward Nora or turning back to salvage what remained of his crumbling empire, and that fatal hesitation cost him the most important final minutes. The last 15 minutes passed in unbearable tension as Lucian's people managed to quietly block the opposing convoy at an intersection only a few kilometers from Nora's restoration studio, creating just enough delay, while an emergency order to retreat finally came from a Richard who no longer had enough force or authority left to continue the pursuit. By the time Lucian's car finally raced onto the narrow street where Nora's restoration studio stood, Richard's team had been forced to turn around and leave the town only a few minutes earlier, without getting a single step closer. Lucian stepped out of the car, Ethan close behind him, and the two of them stood in the middle of the peaceful street where no visible trace remained of the danger that had just passed through. In that moment, Lucian stood silently looking toward the small wooden sign bearing the name of Nora's restoration studio, his chest still rising and falling from a race he had reached the end of only just in time, not because he had possessed overwhelming strength, but because he had managed to seize back a handful of final minutes when almost none remained. The bell above the door of the restoration studio rang just as Nora was bending over to finish the final golden line on an antique vase, and when she lifted her head toward the entrance, her hands froze in midair and the small brush slipped from her trembling fingers. Lucian stood in the doorway. Nearly 2 years apart had made him noticeably thinner, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper than before, but those eyes, the same eyes that had once watched her kneel and beg in vain on that rainy night, were looking at her now with a longing she had never seen during all the time they had once shared. Beside him stood a younger man, a face unfamiliar to Nora yet carrying something that made her look twice, and when Wren, who had been playing in the corner of the studio, ran over and wrapped her arms around her mother's leg, the silence in the room grew heavier than ever. Nora was the first to break it, her voice trembling as 2 years of buried anger suddenly burst free beyond her control. She asked him what he was doing there, after all that silence, after the night he had personally thrown her out of his life in front of 20 men, only to appear now as though nothing had ever happened. Lucian didn't look away. He stood there and accepted every accusation, and when she asked whether he had any idea what she had endured over the past 2 years, whether he knew she had given birth alone in a hospital with no one beside her, whether he knew how many nights she had stayed awake by herself trying to care for a feverish child, her voice broke into a choked sob, and she finally said the words she believed would strike him harder than anything else could. "I have a daughter. You don't even know she exists." Lucian stood completely still for a moment, then lowered himself to his knees until he was at eye level with Wren, who was hiding behind her mother's leg, and in a voice so gentle, Nora had never heard anything like it from him before, he spoke the child's name. Wren. Nora froze. A sudden cold passed through her entire body, because that name, the name she had never spoken to anyone beyond the small town where they lived, had just come from the mouth of the man she believed knew absolutely nothing about his own daughter's existence. She stepped backward, her voice trembling now not from anger, but from a confusion that was spreading through her more deeply with every second. "How do you know her name?" Lucian rose to his feet and faced her directly, and in that moment, every cold layer of control he had carried for the past 2 years seemed to fall away at once, revealing a man exhausted from holding himself together for far too long. He spoke slowly, but each word landed with the weight of stone against her chest. I knew when she was only 4 weeks inside you." Nora stood motionless, unable to say a single word, and Lucian continued, his voice beginning to shake as 2 years of restraint finally found a way out. "I knew you gave birth to her alone in the hospital that night. I knew you lost nearly 1.5 liters of blood. I knew the surgery lasted more than 2 hours, and during those 2 hours, all I could do was sit hundreds of miles away from you and wait for one message telling me you were still alive." He kept going, and now his voice had broken completely, with nothing left of the powerful man whose presence could once silence an entire room. "I knew the day she said her first word. I knew about the night she had a high fever for 3 straight days, and that night I stood on the staircase with my coat already on, ready to get into a car and come find you, but I stopped myself because I knew that if I appeared, you and our daughter would be in danger." Nora stood there with tears running freely down her face, and inside her, the anger she had carried for 2 years began breaking apart into something far more complicated. Pain at realizing that she had borne everything alone, while the man before her had been enduring a different version of the same suffering from far away, and fury that for 2 full years he had hidden the truth and never once given her the chance to know it. She stepped backward again, her voice shaking through her sobs. "You knew for 2 years. You knew everything, and you still left me alone to go through all of it." Lucian didn't defend himself. He simply stood there and let every word strike him like a blade, because he understood that this was the price he had to pay, and before he could say anything more to explain himself, the younger man who had remained silent behind him all this time took one step forward. His voice was rough with emotion as he spoke to Nora using a name no one had called her in a very long time. "Nora, my sister." Nora spun around and stared directly into the face of the young man who had just called her by words she hadn't heard in 2 years, and for one moment, time seemed to stop completely. She studied every feature of that face, the eyes, the bridge of his nose, the way the corner of his mouth lifted slightly when he was worried. All of them details she had believed she would never see again after the day she was told that her younger brother had died in what people had described to her at the time as an unavoidable accident. She stepped backward, gripping the edge of the work table tightly, her voice trembling so badly that it was barely audible. "This can't be possible. You died. They told me you were dead. I've mourned you for 2 years." Ethan took another step toward her, but stopped at exactly the right distance, as though he understood that she needed time to believe what she was seeing, rather than being forced to accept it all at once. He reached into the pocket of his coat and took out a small object carefully wrapped in a piece of soft cloth, and when he unfolded the fabric, there was a tiny shard of broken ceramic inside, no larger than the tip of a finger, with a delicate line of gold running along its fractured edge, made with the exact technique that only Nora and the grandmother who had taught her from childhood would have known how to create. Nora stared at the shard, and she recognized it immediately. It was a broken piece from her grandmother's old teacup, the cup Nora herself had once restored for Ethan to carry with him years ago as a good luck charm, the same cup she had believed was lost with her brother on that fateful day. She reached out with trembling hands and took the small piece from him, and Ethan spoke, his voice catching with emotion that had been buried for far too long. "I've carried this piece with me for the past 2 years. Every time I thought I couldn't endure another day, I took it out and reminded myself that someone was still waiting for me somewhere out there, that I had to survive, that I had to stay silent, and that I had to be patient. He lifted his eyes to his sister, his gaze red with unshed tears. I'm sorry I made you mourn me all this time, but if I had shown myself even once, if I had tried to send you even a single line, they would have found you immediately. I'd rather let you suffer believing I was dead than let you truly be placed in danger because of me. Nora stood silently, clutching the small ceramic fragment tightly in her palm as tears streamed down her face, and she asked through broken sobs why, in all those 2 years, he hadn't found any safer way to let her know he was still alive, so she wouldn't have had to live with that grief every single day for so long. Ethan looked at her with a maturity that only years spent living in danger could have carved into him, and when he answered, it wasn't only for her. It was as though he were explaining everything he had sacrificed during those 2 years. It wasn't only because I was afraid you would be in danger. If I had revealed myself even once, it wouldn't have been just you at risk. Everything Lucian spent so long building to bring Richard down would have collapsed with it. And everyone standing with us, everyone who had already gambled their lives on that plan, would have been dragged down too. I couldn't let my own loneliness send all of them to their deaths. Nora remained still, holding the small ceramic shard tightly in her hand, and for the first time, she understood that her brother's silence hadn't been abandonment. It had been a quiet sacrifice, no less painful than everything she herself had endured. At that moment, Lucian, who had been standing silently behind them and watching the reunion, stepped forward, his voice gentle but filled with determination. I know nothing material can ever make up for what happened, but I want to build you a restoration studio 10 times larger than this one, anywhere you want, with the best equipment available, so you'll never have to worry about anything again. Nora looked at him and slowly shook her head. Her voice still carried the remnants of tears, but it was steadier than ever before. No, you still don't understand. This isn't property you can buy back or replace with something bigger. Every brick in this studio, every customer who trusts me, every golden line I've drawn across a crack, all of it is something I built with my own hands. Not $1 of yours ever touched it. If you buy me 10 larger studios, every one of them will still belong to you, and I'd only be living like a guest inside someone else's home. The moment Nora finished speaking, the room fell into a heavy silence, and in that silence, no one noticed that Ren, who had been hiding behind her mother's leg all this time and watching the unfamiliar man with the curious eyes of a child, not yet 2 years old, had quietly let go of her mother. She took small but steady steps across the wooden floor and walked straight toward Lucian, and when she stopped directly in front of him, she tilted her head back and looked up at the tall stranger with an innocent trust that no one in the room could explain. Ren lifted both tiny arms into the air, the simple gesture only children use when they want to be picked up, and in a soft, unfinished little voice, she said a single word that stunned both Nora and Lucian so completely that neither of them had time to react. Papa. Lucian stood frozen, his hands trembling, and for one moment, the man who had stood firm against every danger throughout 20 years in the underworld had no idea what to do in front of a little girl reaching up and asking him to hold her. He knelt down, slowly and carefully, as though he were afraid of breaking the most precious thing in the world, then lifted Ren into his arms for the first time. Instead of becoming frightened or struggling the way small children often did with strangers, she rested her head against his chest, her tiny hands clutching the front of his coat, completely at ease, as though this weren't the first time they had ever met. Nora stood there watching them, and the wall she had built around herself over the past 2 years, the wall she had believed no explanation could ever shake, began to crack apart in that simple moment, faster than anything Lucian had said before. She realized that blood, even without years of shared memories to nurture it, could still find a way to recognize its own in a manner reason couldn't explain, and it was her little daughter, not any apology, who was pulling the two of them back toward each other faster than anything else could. Lucian held Ren in his arms and turned to look at Nora, and there was no longer the coldness of a crime lord in his eyes, nor the guilt of a man carrying the weight of what he had done. There was only the deepest and most sincere longing she had ever seen in him throughout all the years she had known him. Nora drew in a long breath, wiped the remaining tears from her cheeks, and when she spoke, her voice no longer trembled. It was steady and certain, the same way she had kept her back straight for the past 2 years while surviving everything on her own. If you truly want to come back, I will never kneel again for the rest of my life, and I won't accept being a secret you have to hide the way I was before. She looked directly into his eyes and continued, laying out each condition clearly, as though she had been thinking about them long before this moment ever came. First, if I stand beside you, I stand as your equal, not as a shadow behind you. Second, our daughter has to grow up in the light. She has to go to school like any normal child, have friends, run outside, live in the world, not behind layers of security walls like something that needs to be locked away. Lucian nodded after each condition without interrupting her even once, and Nora continued, her voice softening slightly but never losing its resolve. Third, you have to tell her who you are yourself. I won't do it for you, and you have to wait until she's ready to accept it, no matter how long that takes. She paused for a moment, looked down at the small ceramic fragment still held tightly in her palm, then lifted her head and gave him the final condition, the one she believed mattered more than all the others. And fourth, from this day forward, every decision involving me and our daughter, whether it's meant to protect us or for any other reason, no one gets to make that decision for me again, not even you. Lucian stood there with Ren still in one arm and reached out with his other hand to take Nora's. His voice was firm, without even the slightest hesitation. I accept all of it. Nora looked into his eyes for a long time, searching for any sign of uncertainty or dishonesty, but all she found was complete sincerity, and in the end, she allowed her hand to remain in his. It wasn't forgiveness offered from the position of someone receiving mercy. It was forgiveness given by a woman who had learned to stand firmly on her own feet, and who was now choosing to move forward, not because she needed to be rescued, but because she wanted to. Nora's hand was still resting quietly in Lucian's when she turned to look at Ethan, the younger brother she had spent 2 years believing existed only as an empty grave in the cemetery of their old city. Neither of them rushed toward the other. They stood facing each other across the wooden floor of the restoration studio, and in both of their eyes, the 2 years of separation seemed to need no explanation, because each of them had already lived through the full weight of their own pain, and now, simply seeing the other alive and whole was enough to begin filling the emptiness between them. Nora was the first to step forward, only one step, and then she collapsed into her brother's arms, gripping the front of his coat tightly as though she were afraid that if she let go, everything in front of her would disappear again like a dream. Ethan wrapped his arms around his sister, resting his chin gently on the top of her head, and they remained that way for a very long time without saying a single word, because there are some wounds for which one embrace is enough to begin the healing. That afternoon passed inside the small restoration studio as the last sunlight of the day slipped through the glass windows, turning golden across the ceramic vessels arranged neatly on the shelves, each one carrying shimmering lines of gold that joined together the cracks from its past. Lucian sat on a small wooden chair at a careful distance from Ren, making no move to come closer, allowing the little girl to decide for herself how much space she wanted between them. Wren, still holding a small leftover piece of wood from her mother's work, walked toward him on her own, sat down on the floor directly in front of him, and tapped the wooden floor 3 times in a row with the little piece in her hand, before humming a short melody without clear words, the same little tune she often invented whenever she played by herself. Lucian looked down at his daughter, and without thinking, his hand tapped the side of the chair 3 times in exactly the same rhythm she had just made, an instinctive response he hadn't even realized he was doing. Wren stopped, looked up at him with her eyes wide in surprise, then smiled, a pure, radiant smile spreading across her small face, and she crawled closer, leaning fully against him and wrapping both arms around one of his legs, as though that had always been the place where she belonged. Lucian lifted her into his arms, settled her comfortably on his lap, then lowered his head and gently kissed the top of her hair without saying a word, because there are moments when words become unnecessary in the presence of something sincere. Nora stood leaning against the doorway watching them, one hand rising to cover her mouth, and the tears that rolled down her cheeks this time carried no pain at all, only a peace she had waited 2 long years to finally touch. There are men who choose to love by pushing the person they cherish far away, and there are women who choose to survive by rising from the ruins with their own strength, instead of waiting for someone to come and save them. But the story of Lucian and Nora teaches us something deeper than that knowing someone you love is suffering while being unable to stand beside them can sometimes hurt many times more than knowing nothing at all. 2 years of silence held tightly inside, 2 years of tears allowed to fall only when no one was watching, finally found a way out, not through beautiful promises, but through the honesty of a child who had never learned how to lie, and through the courage of a woman strong enough to stand tall and forgive, instead of kneeling to receive mercy. If the story of Nora and Lucian moved you, please leave a like and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the other emotional stories we share every day. We'd truly love to hear what is in your heart, so please leave a comment below and tell us what you think about Lucian's decision that night, and if you were in Nora's place, whether you would choose to forgive him. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a peaceful life, and days filled with joy. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in our next videos.